The teachings of Ramana Maharishi in his own words. God. Superficially, it might seem that the Maharishi's statement about God were inconsistent, since he would sometimes enjoin complete faith and submission to God and sometimes speak of God as unreal. But actually, there was no inconsistency. It must always be remembered that the purpose of his exposition was not to propound a philosophy but to give practical guidance on the spiritual path. Someone who could conceive of the non dual self could understand that it was his own self and the self of God and of the world also, whereas one who clung to the apparent reality of his ego could understand the self only as the God who had created him. According to their needs, he explained in this, as in other matters, he pointed out the uselessness of discussion. Following either path was useful, theorizing about them was not. All religions postulate the three fundamentals, the world, the soul, and God, but it is the one reality that manifests itself as these three. One can say the three are really three, only so long as the ego lasts. Therefore, to inhere in one's own being when the ego is dead is the perfect state. The world is real. No, it is mere illusory appearance. The world is conscious. No. The world is happiness. No. What use is it to argue thus? That state is agreeable to all wherein, having given up the objective outlook, one knows oneself and lose all notions either of unity or duality, of oneself and the ego. If one has form oneself, the world and God will also appear to have form. But if one is formless, who is to see these forms, and how, without the eye, can any object be seen? The seeing self is the eye, and that eye is the eye of infinity. Brahman is not to be seen or known. It is beyond the threefold relationship of seer, sight, and seen, or knower, knowledge, and known. The reality remains ever as it is. The existence of ignorance or the world is due to our illusion. Neither knowledge nor ignorance is real. What lies beyond them, as beyond all other pairs of opposites, is the reality. It is neither light nor darkness, but beyond both, though we sometimes speak of it as light and of ignorance as its shadow. When there was genuine search for understanding, Bhagwan would explain in some details, always leading the seeker back to the doctrine of the oneself. Mr. Thompson, a very quiet young gentleman who has been staying in India for some years and studying Hindu philosophy as an earnest student, as Srimad Bhagavad Gita says, I am the prop for Brahman. In another place it says, I am in the heart of each one. Thus, the different aspects of the ultimate principle are revealed. I take it that there are three aspects, namely, the transcendental, the immanent, and the cosmic. Is realization to be in any of these or in all of them? Coming to the transcendental from the cosmic, Vedanta discards the name and forms as being Maya. Again, Vedanta also says that the whole is Brahm, as illustrated by gold and ornaments of gold. How are we to understand the truth? Bhagwan said, the Gita says, Brahmano hi paristhanam. If that aham is known, the whole is known. Devotee said, that is the immanent aspect only. Bhagwan said, you now think that you are an individual. Outside you are, there is the universe, and beyond the universe is God. So there is the idea of separateness. The idea must go, for God is not separate from you or the cosmos. The Gita also says, I am the Self, O Gudakesha, seated in the heart of all beings. I am the beginning and the middle and also the end of all beings. Thus, God is not only in the heart of all, He is the prop of all. He is the source of all, their abiding place and their end. All proceed from Him, have their stay in Him, and finally resolve into Him. Therefore, He is not separate. Devotee said, how are we to understand the line in the Gita, thus whole cosmos forms a particle of me? Bhagwan said, it doesn't mean that a small particle of God separates from Him and forms the universe. His Shakti is acting, and as a result of one phase of such activity, the cosmos has become manifest. Similarly, the statement in Purusha Sukta, all beings from one of his parts, doesn't mean that Brahm is in four parts. Devotee said, I understand that Brahm is certainly not divisible. Bhagwan said, so the fact is that Brahm is all and remains indivisible. He is ever realized. However, man doesn't know this, and it is just what he has to know. Knowledge means overcoming the obstacles which obstruct the revelation of the eternal truth that the self is the same as Brahm. The obstacles taken altogether form your idea of separateness as an individual. Therefore, the present attempt will result in the truth being revealed that the self is not separate from Brahm. Christians, except for the greatest mystics, cling to the idea of a permanently real and separate ego. Sri Bhagwan had a discussion on this point with the Jesus Father, but it remained inconclusive. Bhagwan trying to turn the Father's mind inward to self inquiry, and the Father demanding a theoretical exposition instead. Dr. Emily Gethier, S.J., Professor of Philosophy at the Sacred Heart College, Shin, Bengal, Kodaikanal, asked, can you kindly give me a summary of your teachings? Bhagwan said, they are found in the booklets, particularly in Who Am I? Devotee asked, I shall read them, but may I have the central point of your teaching from your own lips? Bhagwan said, the central point is just the thing. Devotee said, it is not clear to me what you mean by that. Bhagwan said, that you should find the center. Devotee asked, I come from God. Is not God distinct from me? Bhagwan said, who asked this question? God doesn't, you do. So find who are you, and then you may find out whether God is distinct from you. Devotee asked, but God is perfect and I am imperfect. How can I ever know Him fully? Bhagwan said, God doesn't say so. It is you who ask the question. After finding out who you are, you may know what God is. Devotee said, but you have found yourself. Please let us know if God is distinct from you. Bhagwan said, it is a matter of experience. Each one must experience it for himself. Devotee asked, oh, I see. God is infinite and I am finite. I have a personality which can never merge into God. Is not that so? Bhagwan said, Infinity and perfection do not admit of parts. If a finite being is apart from infinity, the perfection of infinity is marred. Thus, your statement is a contradiction in terms. Devotee said, No, see, there is both God and creation. Bhagwan asked, How are you aware of your personality? Devotee said, I have a soul, I know it by its activities. Bhagwan asked, Did you know it in deep sleep? Devotee said, The activities are suspended in deep sleep. Bhagwan asked, But you exist in sleep and you do now too. Which of these two is your real state? Devotee said, Sleep and waking are mere accidents. I am the substance behind the accidents. He looked up at the clock and said that it was time for him to catch the train. He left after thanking Sri Bhagwan, so the conversation ended abruptly. The following talk takes up various problems which plague philosophers and theologians: divine omniscience and free will, natural laws and divine activity, personal God and impersonal, and yet the tone of the answer shows that Bhagwan considers it of rather secondary importance. Devotee asked, What is the relation between my free will and the overshadowing might of the omnipotent? Is the omnipotence of God consistent with the ego's free will? Is the omniscience of God consistent with the ego's free will? Are natural laws consistent with God's free will? Bhagwan said, Yes, free will is the present appearing to a limited faculty of sight and will. That same ego sees its past activity as falling into a course of law or rules, its own free will being one of the links in the course of law. The omnipotence and omniscience of God are then seen by the ego to have acted through the appearance of his own free will. So he comes to the conclusion that the ego must go by appearances. Natural laws are manifestations of God's will and they have been laid down. The following dialogue is characteristic as showing refusal to discuss theory and insistence on the need for practice. Devotee asked, Is God personal? Bhagwan said, Yes, he is always the first person, the I, ever standing before you. Because you give precedence to worldly things, God appears to have receded to the background. If you give up all else and seek Him alone, He will remain as I, the Self. Devotee asked, The final state of realization is said, according to Advaita, to be absolute union with the Divine, and according to Vasishtha Devaitya, a qualified union, while Devaitya maintains that there is no union at all. Which of these should be considered the correct view? Bhagwan said, Why speculate about what will happen at some time in the future? All are agreed that the I exists. To whichever school of thought he may belong, let the earnest seeker first find out what the I is. Then it will be time enough to know what the final state will be, whether the I will get merged in the Supreme Being or stand apart from Him. Let us not forestall the conclusion, but keep an open mind. Devotee asked, But will not some understanding of the final state to be a helpful guide even to the aspirant? Bhagwan said, No purpose is served by trying to decide now what the final state of realization will be. It has no intrinsic value. Devotee asked, "Why not?" Bhagwan said, "Because you proceed on a wrong principle. Your conclusion is arrived at by the intellect, which shines only by the light it derives from the self. It is not presumptuous on the part of the intellect to sit in judgment over that from which it derives its little light. How can the intellect, which can never reach the self, be competent to ascertain and much less decide the nature of the final state of realization? It is like trying to measure the sunlight as its source by the standard of the light given by a candle. The wax will melt down before the candle comes anywhere near the sun. Instead of indulging in mere speculation, devote yourself here and now to search for the truth that is ever within you. Sometimes questions were also asked about the multiple gods of Hinduism. In this connection, it should be explained that Hindus, like Christians or Muslims, worship the one God. Some of the questions about God recorded above were put by Hindus. However, they also worship God manifested in various forms. One possibility or name or form or viewpoint not negating another. Devotee asked, "Why are you so many gods mentioned?" Bhagwan said, "The body is only one, but how many functions are performed by it? The source of all these functions is one. It is the same with the gods." It would sometimes be asked whether the various gods and their heavens were real. But such a question starts from the presumption of the reality of this physical world and the questioner's body, a presumption which Bhagwan would not admit. Instead, he would turn this question, like all other, to the quest of reality. Devotee asked, "Are the gods Ishvara and Vishnu and their heavens, Kalyas and Vaikuntha real?" Bhagwan said, "As real as you are in this body." Devotee asked, "I mean, have they got a phenomenal existence like my body, or are they pure fictions like the horns of a hare?" Bhagwan said, "They do exist." Devotee asked, "If so, they must be somewhere. Where are they?" Bhagwan said, "In you." Devotee asked, "Then they are only my idea, something which I create and control." Bhagwan said, "Everything is." Devotee asked, "But I can create a pure fiction like the horns of a hare, or a partial truth like a mirage, where there are also facts which exist irrespective of my imagination. Do the gods Ishvara and Vishnu exist like that?" Bhagwan said, "Yes." Devotee asked, "Is God subject to cosmic dissolution at the end of a cycle?" Bhagwan said, "Why should he be? A man who realizes the self transcends cosmic dissolution and is liberated. Why should not Ishvara, God, who is infinitely wiser and abler than a man?" Devotee asked, "Do gods and devils also exist?" Bhagwan said, "Yes." Devotee asked, "How are we to conceive of supreme divine consciousness?" Bhagwan said, "As that which is." Particularly interesting are the questions asked by a Muslim professor about the hymns which Bhagwan wrote to God in the form of Arunachala. Devotee asked, "I have been reading the 5 hymns. I find that the hymns are addressed by you to Arunachala, but you are a non dualist. So, how can you address God as a separate being?" Bhagwan said, "The devotee, God and the hymns are all the self." Devotee said, "But you are addressing God. You are specifying this Arunachala hill as God. Bhagwan said, you can identify the self with the body. So why shouldn't the devotees identify the self with Arunachala? Devotee said, if Arunachala is the self, why should it be specifically picked out among so many other hills? God is everywhere. Why do you specify him as Arunachala? Bhagwan said, what has attracted you from Allahabad to this place? What has attracted all these people around? Devotee said, Sri Bhagwan. Bhagwan said, how was I attracted here by Arunachala? The power cannot be denied. Again, Arunachala is within and not without. The self is Arunachala. Devotee asked, several terms are used in the holy books Atma, Paramatma, Para, etc. What is the gradation among them? Bhagwan said, they mean the same to the user of the words, but they are understood differently by various persons according to their development. Devotee asked, but why do you use so many words to mean the same thing? Bhagwan said, it depends on the circumstances. They all mean the self. Para means not relative or beyond the relative, that is to say, the absolute. Bhagwan would often make remarks which the superficial critic might take to be agnostic or atheistic, just as he has been done by superficial critics of the Buddha. For instance, he might say, why worry about God? We do not know whether God exists, but we know that we exist. So first concentrate on yourself, find out who are you. There was no agnosticism since Bhagwan, like the Buddha, spoke from perfect knowledge. He was simply placing himself to the position of the questioner and advising him to concentrate rather on what he knew than what he merely believed in. Sometimes he would tell people not to trouble whether there is God or whether realization implies unity with God or not, but simply to strive to realize the self, and when that was achieved, they would know theorizing about it would not help them. The Malayalam version of Ulladu Narpadu 40 verses was read out by a devotee for the benefit of a visitor. After hearing it, the latter asked, what about the reference to duality during one's effort and unity at the end? Bhagwan said, it refers to people who think one must begin one's spiritual striving with a dualistic idea. They say that there is God and that one must worship and meditate until ultimately the individual merges into God. Others say that the individual and the Supreme Being always remain separate and never merge. But let's not worry now about what remains at the end. All agree that the individual exists now. So let a man discover it, that is, discover his self. There will be time enough afterwards to find out whether the self is to merge in the Supreme or is a part of it or remains separate. Let us not forestall the conclusion. Keep an mind open, dive within and find the self. The truth will dawn upon you all right. So, why try to decide beforehand whether it is absolute or qualified unity or duality? There is no meaning in doing so. Your decision would have to be made by logic and intellect. But the intellect derives its light from the self, the highest power. So, how can it, reflected and partial light, envisage the entire and original light? The intellect cannot attain to the self, so how can it ascertain its nature? While explaining to an American lady, Bhagwan said, the self alone is real, all else is unreal. The mind and intellect have no existence apart from you. The Bible says, "Be still and know that I am God." Stillness is the only thing needed to realize that I am is God. Later he added, the whole Vedanta is contained in the two biblical statements, "I am that I am," and "Be still and know that I am God." For one who finds self inquiry too difficult, he would recommend worship and submission. Devotee asked, "What should one think of when meditating?" Bhagwan said, "What is meditation? It is the suspension of thoughts. You are perturbed by thoughts which rush one after another. Hold on to one thought so that other are expelled. Continuous practice gives the necessary strength of mind to engage in meditation. Meditation differs according to the degree of advancement of the seeker. If one is fit for it, one can hold directly to the thinker, and the thinker will automatically sink into his source, which is pure consciousness. If one cannot directly hold on to the thinker, one must meditate on God, and in due course the same individual will have become sufficiently pure to hold on to the thinker and sink into the absolute being. In case the path of worship was chosen, he demanded absolute surrender. Devotee said, God is described as manifest and unmanifest. As the former, he is said to include the world as a part of his being. If that is so, we, as part of the world, should find it easy to know him in his manifested form. Bhagwan said, "Know yourself before you ask to know the nature of God and the world." Devotee asked, "Does knowing myself imply knowing God?" Bhagwan said, "Yes, God is within you." Devotee asked, "Then what stands in the way of my knowing myself or God?" Bhagwan said, "Your wandering minds and perverted ways." Devotee asked, "I am a weak creature, but why does not the superior power of the God within remove the obstacles?" Bhagwan said, "Yes, he will, if you have the aspiration." Devotee asked, "Why should he not create the aspiration in me?" Bhagwan said, "Then surrender yourself." Then devotee asked, "If I surrender myself, is no prayer to God necessary?" Bhagwan said, "Surrender itself is a mighty prayer." Devotee asked, "But it is not necessary to understand his nature before one surrenders oneself." Bhagwan said, "If you believe that God will do all the things that you want him to do, then surrender yourself to him. Otherwise, let God alone and know yourself. If there be true surrender, there can be no complaint or frustration." Devotee asked, "We are worldly people and are afflicted by some grief that we cannot get over. We pray to God and are still not satisfied. What should we do?" Bhagwan said, "Trust God." Devotee said, "We surrender, but still there is no help." Bhagwan said, "But if you have surrendered, it means that you must accept the will of God and not make a grievance of what may not happen to please you. Things may turn out differently from what they appear. Distress often leads people to faith in God." Devotee said, "But we are worldly people, we have wife, children, friends, and relations. We cannot ignore them and resign ourselves to the divine will without remaining some trace of individuality." Bhagwan said, "That means that you have not really surrendered as you say you have. All you need to do is to trust God. Following the path of devotion, one should leave everything to God. The Lord bears the burden of the world. Know that the spurious ego, which presumes to bear that burden, is like a sculptured figure at the foot of a temple tower, which appears to sustain the tower's weight, whose fault is it if the traveler, instead of putting his luggage in the cart which bears the load anyway, carries it on his head to his own inconvenience? There cannot even be impatience for speedy realization. To one who was so afflicted, he replied, "Surrender to him and accept his will, whether he appears or vanishes, awaits his pleasure. If you want him to do as you want, it is not surrender but command. You cannot ask him to obey you and yet think you have surrendered. He knows what is best and when and how to do it. Leave everything entirely to him. The burden is his and you have no more cares. All your cares are his. That is what is meant by surrender. Even prayer can betoken a lack of trust, and Bhagwan did not normally encourage prayer in the sense of petition. They pray to God and finish with, "Thy will be done." If His will be done, why do they prayer at all? It is true that the divine will prevails at all times and under all circumstances. Individuals cannot act of their own accord, recognize the force of the divine will, and keep quiet. Everyone is looked after by God. He created all. You are only one among 2,000 millions. When He looks after so many, will He omit you? Even common sense dictates that one should accept His will. There is no need to tell Him your requirements. He knows them Himself and will look after them. On other occasions, however, He would confirm the efficacy of prayer. As in other matters, He would put the viewpoint which would best help the spiritual development of the particular questioner. Devotee asked, are our prayers granted? Bhagwan said, yes, they are granted. No thought will ever go in vain. Every thought will produce its effect some time or other. Thought force will never go in vain. It will be seen that this hints to a doctrine far wider than personal response by an anthropomorphic God. It indicates the general power of thought for good or evil and its repercussions on the thinker. Understanding of this involves a great responsibility for thoughts no less than for action, just as Christ indicated that to look at a woman lustfully was a sin, the same as committing adultery with her. The following passage shows how far this teaching was from any humanized conception of a God, not from any desire, resolve, or effort on the part of rising sun, but merely due to the presence of his rays. The lens emits heat, the lotus blossoms, water evaporates, and people attend to their various duties in life. In the proximity of the magnet, the needle moves. Similarly, the soul or jiva, subjected to the threefold activity of creation, preservation, and destruction, which takes merely due to the unique presence of the Supreme Lord, performs acts in accordance with its karma and subsides to rest after such activity. But the Lord Himself has no resolve. No act or event touches even the fringe of His being. This state of immaculate aloofness can be likened to that of the sun, which is untouched by the activities of life, or to that of the all pervasive ether, which is not affected by the interaction of the complex qualities of the other four elements. Hari Om Tat Sat.